There are moments in history when God decides that the time for silence is over, when what has been hidden beneath layers of confusion and human manipulation must come to light. It doesn't happen because the world demands it. It happens because heaven ordains it. You see, man can conceal things for a season, but never forever. God's truth has a way of breaking through the noise, piercing through the fog, and exposing what's been lurking in the shadows. When God exposes something, it's not out of malice, it's out of mercy. It's His way of shaking us awake, reminding us that He is still sovereign, still in control, and still the final authority on what is true. Charlie Kirk's story isn't about fame or controversy. It's about timing, divine timing. God chose this moment to unveil certain truths, not just about a man, but about the spiritual state of our world. The revelation isn't limited to headlines or opinions. It's spiritual. It's God reminding us that He uses people, even imperfect ones, as vessels to reveal what He wants His people to see. Sometimes He allows a person to rise in influence, not because they are flawless, but because their visibility becomes the stage upon which He performs His truth. When we look at how God has always worked, we see a pattern. He exposed Pharaoh's pride to reveal His power. He uncovered David's sin to reveal His mercy. He even used the weakness of Peter to reveal His grace. In every generation, God exposes what needs to be revealed, not to shame, but to save. That's what's happening now. What man thought could be controlled, shaped, or concealed is being unwrapped by the hand of God Himself. And when He begins to pull back the curtain, there's no hiding place left. The truth is, we live in a time when deception is celebrated and honesty is inconvenient. But God doesn't operate by the comfort of our culture. He operates by the authority of His Word. And when He reveals something, it's not to entertain curiosity, it's to awaken conviction. Charlie Kirk's emergence as a voice in this generation is not coincidence. It's evidence that God is still revealing His truth through people who dare to stand when the world bows. The message behind it all is simple: truth cannot stay buried. It may be resisted, it may be ridiculed, but it cannot be silenced. So when God's light shines on something hidden, don't look away, lean in. Because what He reveals always carries purpose. This moment, this unveiling, is not about glorifying a person, but glorifying the God who exposes falsehoods and calls His people back to discernment. Every revelation God allows is a reminder that nothing escapes His sight. No matter how dark the world becomes, His truth remains undefeated, and when He speaks, everything hidden must bow to the light. We are living in an age where truth has become a battlefield. It's not just about politics, ideologies, or social movements. It's about the soul of humanity. The enemy is clever. He doesn't always attack with force. Sometimes he whispers with charm. He disguises lies in language that sounds compassionate, progressive, or enlightened. And while many believe the battle is happening in the halls of government or in the media, the real war is spiritual. It's being waged in the unseen realm, between truth and deception, light and darkness, heaven and hell. What's happening around Charlie Kirk isn't just a cultural moment, it's a reflection of this deeper war. The Bible warns us that in the last days, deception will not just exist, it will thrive. People will believe lies because they sound comfortable, and they'll reject truth because it sounds convicting. And that's exactly where we are. We're watching a generation confused about what's real, uncertain about who to trust, and blinded by the noise of information. But here's the thing: God's truth doesn't need to compete with deception. It simply needs to be revealed. When light shines, darkness doesn't argue, it just disappears. That's why the truth about Charlie Kirk isn't just about what he says or stands for. It's about what God is showing us through him. Every voice that dares to speak biblical truth in a world built on lies becomes a target. The enemy can't stand the sound of truth because truth exposes him. So when a person stands up like Charlie to defend moral clarity, to speak about values rooted in Scripture, or to challenge the cultural decay around us, the enemy doesn't stay silent. He responds with mockery, division, and distortion. But what he intends for harm, God uses for good. The conflict itself becomes proof that truth still has power. If what he was saying didn't carry weight, the world wouldn't fight so hard to silence it. We have to remember, truth isn't a weapon of man. It's the sword of the Spirit. It's not meant to win arguments. It's meant to set people free. And while deception thrives on emotion, truth stands on revelation. The battle we see is only the surface of something much deeper, something eternal. That's why we must be vigilant. We can't let our hearts be swayed by what sounds good. We must be anchored by what is good, by what God has declared. This hidden truth being revealed is not about one man. It's about what God is teaching through the conflict surrounding him. He's calling his people to wake up, to see past the illusion, and to recognize that not every loud voice carries light, and not every quiet one lacks authority. God's truth doesn't shout, it pierces. And when it pierces, it divides the false from the real. The battle between truth and deception may rage on, but in the end, truth will always stand because truth belongs to God. God has always chosen the most unlikely voices to carry his message. Throughout Scripture, we see him reaching into obscurity, calling ordinary people to do extraordinary things. He called Moses from the wilderness, David from the pasture, and Peter from a fishing boat. He never looked for perfection. He looked for obedience. And even today, that same pattern continues. God is still calling voices to rise in a world that's fallen silent about righteousness. Charlie Kirk's journey isn't an accident. It's evidence that when God places a calling on someone's life, he equips them to speak truth into a generation desperate for clarity. When God calls a person to speak, it's never comfortable. It often begins in the quiet places where conviction burns stronger than fear. Before anyone hears the voice publicly, God shapes it privately. He refines it in the fires of criticism, molds it through the storms of rejection, and strengthens it through seasons of doubt. Because only when a person has wrestled in the dark can they stand boldly in the light. Charlie's rise as a voice in culture didn't come from ambition. It came from assignment. God positioned him not just for influence, but for impact. We live in a time where truth is costly. Speaking it out loud feels dangerous. But God has always called his people to courage, not comfort. When a man or woman stands for truth, especially in a world that rewards compromise, they step into the same lineage as the prophets who cried out against idolatry, the apostles who defied empires, and the saints who refused to bow to popular opinion. That kind of boldness doesn't come from personality. It comes from purpose. It comes from knowing that silence in the face of evil is not humility, it's surrender. And God didn't call us to surrender to the world. He called us to stand against it. Charlie's voice, like many others God has raised, isn't meant to glorify him. It's meant to remind the church that courage is still the currency of calling. God doesn't need polished speeches or perfect lives. He needs willing hearts. And when someone is willing to speak truth, even when it costs them everything, heaven takes notice. Because courage is contagious. One obedient voice can awaken thousands. One stand can spark revival. One message rooted in conviction can shake a nation. You see, God never wastes a voice He anoints. He uses it to challenge, to convict, and to call people back to Himself. And though the world may not understand it, heaven celebrates it. Because in the end, God's calling is never about fame, it's about faithfulness. The courageous voice that stands for God may face rejection on earth, but it echoes through eternity as a testimony that truth was spoken and light was not silenced. Every time God raises someone to stand for truth, there comes a price. The moment you decide to stand on the side of righteousness, you invite resistance, because truth will always challenge what the world wants to protect. It exposes the comfort of compromise and confronts the lies people would rather believe. And make no mistake, when God gives someone a voice to declare His truth, that voice will be tested. The weight of that calling is not light. It demands sacrifice. It costs reputation, comfort, relationships, and often peace. But it's in that cost that the authenticity of the calling is proven. Charlie Kirk's journey is a reminder of this eternal principle. When you choose to stand for biblical truth in a culture that celebrates sin, you become a target. You face ridicule, misunderstanding, and false accusations. But that's the path of every servant God has ever used. It's the same path walked by prophets who were mocked, apostles who were imprisoned, and disciples who laid down their lives rather than compromise what they believed. God never promised the truth teller applause. He promised them His presence. And sometimes His presence is all that sustains a person when the crowd turns away. The world loves comfort but despises conviction. And yet, conviction is what births revival. God allows pressure not to crush His servants but to purify them. Every attack, every moment of rejection, every unfair headline, these become the refining fire that strengthens the soul. Because before God uses a man publicly, He tests him privately. He allows the storms so the roots of faith go deeper. He allows the resistance so that dependence on Him becomes absolute. What looks like struggle from the outside is actually preparation from heaven. And that's the beauty of God's process. The pain isn't wasted. The criticism isn't random. It's all part of the shaping. When someone like Charlie endures the backlash that comes with truth, it's not because God has abandoned them. It's because He's preparing them for greater influence. Those who carry truth must first carry a cross. The message of the gospel has never been about ease. It has always been about endurance. To follow Christ is to walk uphill against the current of culture, holding firm to a faith that refuses to bend. God's hidden truth in moments like these is that suffering for righteousness is not a sign of defeat. It's a mark of divine favor. The fire that tests the voice also purifies it. The attacks that try to silence it only amplify its impact. Because when you've paid a price for what you believe, your words carry weight. And those who stand for truth, no matter how fierce the opposition, stand not alone, but under the covering of the one who called them. The cost is great, but the reward is eternal. The world measures success by platforms, but God measures it by purpose. In our generation, it's easy to confuse influence with impact and visibility with value. But God doesn't elevate people for applause. He raises them for assignment. Every platform He allows is meant to serve His kingdom, not personal ambition. And when we look at Charlie Kirk, we see more than a man with a microphone. We see a reminder of how God can turn any stage into a pulpit if the heart behind it belongs to Him. The question isn't how large the audience is. The question is whose message is being spoken. God never wastes a voice. that's willing to be used for His glory. He can take a young person, a businessman, a teacher, or a public figure and place them where their words reach thousands, not because they are deserving, but because He has a purpose that needs to be heard. That's how God operates. He transforms ordinary influence into divine impact. But with that calling comes responsibility. Every platform is a test of stewardship. God doesn't give influence so we can shine brighter. He gives it so He can. The higher He lifts us, the more He expects us to reflect His light, not our own. Charlie's voice in culture is more than commentary, it's conviction. It's the kind of influence that challenges a generation to think differently, to measure truth by Scripture rather than trends, and to live boldly in faith rather than fear. That's not the work of a man, it's the work of God through a man. And that's what the world so often forgets. The platform may be public, but the power behind it is spiritual. God uses people as instruments, but the music is His. We have to remember that every believer, in some way, has a platform. It might not be on a stage or a screen, but it's there. In our homes, our workplaces, our friendships. And just like Charlie, we're all faced with the same question. Will we use what God has given us to serve His purpose or our pride? Because when we surrender our platform to Him, He multiplies its reach. But when we cling to it for ourselves, it eventually collapses under the weight of ego. God doesn't bless influence that glorifies man. He blesses obedience that glorifies Him. That's why this revelation matters. It's not about celebrity, it's about calling. God is reminding His people that the voices He raises are not for entertainment, but for awakening. The hidden truth is that every gift, every opportunity, and every platform belongs to the giver, not the receiver. And when we finally understand that, when we lay our influence back at His feet, something powerful happens. Our platforms turn into altars, and our influence becomes worship. Because in the end, God's purpose is never to make a person famous, but to make His name known. When God reveals something, He never does it to draw attention to the person. It's always to direct the spotlight back to Himself. The revelation surrounding Charlie Kirk isn't about exalting a man. It's about magnifying the truth that God is still at work in the lives of those who are willing to be used. Too often, we become fixated on personalities, forgetting that they're only instruments in the hands of a perfect composer. God doesn't need celebrities, He needs surrender. He doesn't need fame, He desires faithfulness. The true revelation is never about the vessel, it's about the message that flows through it. When God decides to use someone publicly, He always keeps them grounded privately. Because the higher the platform, the greater the temptation to believe it's about you. But the Lord never shares His glory. He'll bless, He'll anoint, He'll expand influence. But the moment pride tries to take credit for what only God can do, He'll remind us who the real source of power is. That's why every revelation, every truth exposed, must lead us back to Him. Charlie's story, like so many others God has raised in our time, isn't meant to make us admire a person. It's meant to awaken us to the God who still reveals, still redeems, and still reigns. Every move of God has always had this same rhythm. He chooses someone, He uses them to speak truth, and then He shifts the attention heavenward. Because the message is never about the messenger, it's about the one who sent it. This is where so many lose sight of God's plan. They focus on the vessel and forget the voice behind it. But God's hidden truth never glorifies humanity, it glorifies His holiness. And that's what makes His work so beautiful. He takes broken, imperfect, ordinary people, and uses them to accomplish eternal things. Charlie Kirk's rise in influence is not the point, it's the pattern. It shows how God still raises bold voices in a generation that has silenced truth. It reminds us that He still equips men and women to stand, to speak, and to stir conviction in hearts that have grown numb. And if we're paying attention, we'll realize that the real revelation isn't what God is doing through Him. It's what God is calling us to do because of it. Every revelation from heaven is also an invitation to respond, to align, and to live boldly for the same truth being declared. So the hidden truth revealed here leads us to one conclusion: everything God